Welcome to the Colony Archive, a weekly review and analysis on the politics of empire and resistance. Today we have with us the founder of PersianPoetics, Mohammad Ali Mojaradi, or if I want to anglicize his name, Mohammad Ali Mojaradi. In the social media space, he's also known as Sharkhzadeh. Mohammad Ali is the author of the book, The Flame of Love, Rumi's 100 Most Passionate Poems, which will be out in March of this year. I've known Mohammad Ali for a good part of a decade now, and he's one of the most genuine and passionate people I know who talks about Persian literature and Persian poetry. So stay with us and listen to our conversation about Persian literature and more. Welcome to the Colony Archive, Mohammad Ali.
Thank you for having me, Navid, John.
Great. So let's start with, in the introduction, I spoke about your book, The Flame of Love, and the subtitle is Rumi's 100 Most Passionate Poems. So as I said in the introduction, you have translated Rumi's poems, and Rumi is very much a beloved figure in Western countries, but people don't always know about the content of his poetry. So tell us about who Rumi is and how your translation of Rumi differs from existing translations.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. What you pointed out about my name, it's interesting. No one has mentioned that before. Really hits to the crux of this issue. So my name in Persian is Mohammad Ali Mojaradi, and then when it comes to English, it becomes Mohammad Ali Mojaradi. And this transition that we just saw with my name really kind of explains why there are two Rumis, right? So the Rumi that's known there in our home country in Iran, if you go in Inqilab Street and go to the bookstores, the Maulana, as we call him, that is read in those bookstores, and the Rumi that's right in Barnes and Nobles, here in New York in Midtown somewhere. Rumi is a 13th century Persian speaking poet. And I say Persian speaking, it's a very specific choice because unfortunately in our modern, and I know this is part of the theme of your show, our modern colonized Muslim world where we are so obsessed with contemporary boundaries and contemporary notions of nationalism, it's a big fight about what Rumi is. But without a doubt, he was Persian speaking. And the place he was born in, a small village on the border of Tajikistan and Afghanistan, Vakhsh. Also, he was originally from Balkh. His family hails from there, but he was born in a small town. Was part of a greater Iranian Persian-speaking cultural sphere than our original kind of sphere of influence, where our culture, our Persian-speaking culture abounded. So Rumi was born on the easternmost edge of the Persianate world, Iran Zamin, Iran Bozorg, as we say in Persian. And what happened was through a series of events, it could have been because of the impending Mongol invasions, as we know, really ravaged Iran. His family went westward while he was a child. So he might have lived in Samarkand for some time, but he travels westward in through northeastern Iran, where it said he might have met Attar-e-Nishaburi, actually, although we're not sure about that, but he might have. Then he went westward to Baghdad, which at the time was also part of the Iranian kind of cultural sphere. And then from Baghdad, they went and did Hajj. And then they went up to Syria and Damascus. And then they were out of the Iranian cultural sphere by then. And then they went up to Anatolia, which was ruled by the Seljuks. And in my own hometown of Tehran, there's Seljuk monuments. So these were a Turco-Persianate Iranian ruling family. And they had recently conquered Anatolia.
And I think this really complicates the whole notion that Rumi is Iranian, because in Iran, people claim that he's Iranian, and I think you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but I think also in Afghanistan and Turkey, they might claim Rumi as their own. So what you're describing in terms of where he belonged and where he was traveling and his affiliations, it really complicates the whole nationalist narrative that Rumi is either from this country or that country.
Absolutely. It's hard to say that Rumi belongs to one modern country or another. I think Rumi is not about national successorship, it's about spiritual successorship. So people who read his poetry, they love his poetry, they feel what he says deeply in their hearts, and this includes Persians, Tajiks, Afghans, Turks. I feel like they have a claim of spiritual successorship, and that's really what counts, right? If whether Rumi was Iranian or Afghan, to me it's not an important debate, right? We are all rightful claims to his beautiful spiritual heritage. But in any case, he lived in Turkey on what was then not Turkey, what later became Turkey, in Seljuk Anatolia on basically the frontier of Persianate Islam. So when we talk about Iran Bozorg, or Iran's cultural influence, it expanded and contracted, right? So pre-Islam, it expanded, and then Islam came and it contracted. And then again, because of Islam, it expanded again. So we didn't have Persian-speaking communities way out in Anatolia next to Greece during pre-Islam. But because of Islam and because of the Seljuks, Rumi goes from the easternmost end to the westernmost end of the Persian Empire, or the Persianite realm, not the empire at this point. And he lives there with his father, who was a cleric. So in Iranian society, we would say he's something like a Rohani, or even kind of an Ayatollah in a way, a Sunni version, because he was giving fatwas, he was giving rulings.
Although Ayatollah,
So
Ayatollah is a very new title, but I see what you mean. You're saying that if you want to compare it to the very modern terms.
If you can correct me, the person who gives the fiqh rulings, I think Mujtahid might be the historical title.
That's right.
Mujtahid is which
Mujtahid,
yeah.
Or Faqih. Also Faqih was a pre-modern title that they use. Or Sheikh, or I mean, if the person taught at the madrasa, they would also call him Mudarris.
Okay.
But Ayatollah
Well,
actually,
that's what they would be doing.
Yeah, Ayatollah actually emerges in the Pahlavi period, and especially with Ayatollah Burujerdi, who's one of the highest Maraja Taqlid, the sources of emulation for Shias during Muhammad Reza Shah's time. The title becomes more codified, but I think it even dates back to the Reza Shah period. But I actually haven't seen the title of Ayatollah in the Qajar period. Same with Rohaniyat, because Rohaniyat that we use in the Persian-speaking world and also in Iran to refer to the clergy, that is also a Reza Shah era neologism. Because in the Qajar period and before that, if they say somebody is Rohani or they have Rohaniyat or a spirituality, or the person is a spiritualist, it was rather an adjective for praise. It was an honorific to describe them with good qualities. But it's in the Reza Shah period that they shift to the spiritualist title, because they're trying to dispossess the ulama, someone like Rumi's father, of monopoly on knowledge. And they want to say that if you go to the university...
No, I agree with that completely. No, the idea is your expertise only extends to religious matters. You don't have any worldly expertise about anything. Yeah,
it's about ritual.
People don't think about these things enough.
Yeah, but going back to your point, I mean, we'll get more to his biography, but I guess so. One thing that we could perhaps establish based on what you're saying is that. Even though it's people from Turkey today or from Iran or Afghanistan cannot claim him, but the Persian or the Persianite culture can claim him. Is that right?
I think it's fair to say, to me, it's not fruitful to fight about, let's have a hypothetical thought experiment. Let's say if Rumi was born today, what would his nationality be? Well, maybe he would have a Tajik passport. And because he moved to Turkey, he would become a Turkish citizen. So he would be a Turkish citizen and a citizen of Tajikistan. So if people find these debates interesting, they can argue on my comments on my page, as you'll see. Today, I literally posted a video about Rumi's name, and the comments just became arguing whether he was Afghan or Iranian. But to me, the idea is, are you benefiting from his worldview or not? Not if you're his same nationality. Well, let's say you share a nationality with him. Does that mean you understand him all of a sudden? Of what use is that? And Islam has this transnational ethos, right? So for Shi'i Muslims living in Iran, people in southern Lebanon and in Bahrain and in eastern Saudi Arabia are important, right? You can't just say, oh, because they're Lebanese, they're not Iranian, so we don't care. And for someone who loves Rumi like me, Konya is important. And Samarkand and Bukhara are important. And Khorasan is important. So we can't just say, oh, we're only thinking about the countries that we're from. We're an ummah, we're a region, we're a transnational culture. You go to Istanbul and you see Persian poetry and the Sufi gatherings on the wall and the Rumi khanaqahs, as we would say in Persian. You go everywhere and you see this influence of this culture, and we're all inheritors of it. So I don't think it's possible to say it only belongs to one people. It's a human heritage, ultimately.
That's right. Yes, I think that's really important, that transnational Persianite culture that's shared in a very wide region, stretching from Central Asia to South Asia to West Asia, and even as far as Asia Minor, and you could say even in Caucasia. I mean, you have a lot of
absolutely,
yeah, no. Yeah,
Definitely.
but then the other question, and
Absolutely.
I mean, I think this question, because when it comes to a Western audience, I think they're comfortable with his Persian connection, because Persian is something that's more acceptable in
Mhm.
Western high culture. But then there's a question as to whether he was a Muslim, and I think you've addressed this in your work. So can you tell us, was Rumi a Muslim?
Absolutely. Yeah, I can say with confidence that he was. And
Good.
this one movement or this one campaign I kicked off is probably the reason that this has become my career. I can't say it's the reason we're speaking because I've had the pleasure of having met you before and I hope to again, but it's probably the
Inshallah.
reason that my life has become dedicated to Rumi. So I started basically a campaign addressing this issue, saying that yes, Rumi was a Muslim. And you would think, why would you have to say that? Isn't it obvious? We just talked about how him and his father were the equivalent of what we would call a faqih or an ayatollah. But in the West, there is this idea that whatever comes from Islamdom is suspect by default, right? Anything that comes from this part of the world is treated with suspicion. Is it extreme? Is it backwards? Is it oriental? And then once it passes through the filter and it gets the approval, then they say, well, this is not because of Islam. This is actually in spite of Islam. So Rumi wasn't great because he was Persian, and Persians have a history of multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism and deep thoughts and philosophy and spirituality, this multi-thousand-year tradition. No, it's not because of that. And it's not because he's a Muslim, because Islam is backwards and violent and terrible and mean. So it's in spite of those things, not because of those things. So it's almost like Rumi was. There's a famous quote. I don't want to derail the conversation. That Iran's geography is an accident of history. Have you heard this quote before? That Iranians, we might as well be Europeans.
Yeah,
You've
yeah.
heard this line of thinking,
It's
right?
also
Yeah.
the idea
This
of
is the idea with Rumi. Go
yeah.
ahead.
No, and I mean also the idea of dislocation. So Iranians thinking that they have more in common with the Germans or the Italians
Exactly.
as opposed to their
Exactly.
neighbors.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
It's so funny. So Rumi is like an example of this. So they imagine Rumi as this dislocated person, who should have been born in Europe, but he was, accidentally born in Afghanistan, in that poor backwards place. And then he moved to Turkey, which is a little less backwards. And he managed to overcome Islam as a burden. So Islam is not a propelling force. So Rumi isn't looking at Islam and actually deriving his enlightenment, his worldview, his cosmopolitanism from Islam. No, Islam is whispering, Rumi, be backwards, Rumi, be evil, Rumi, be mean. And Rumi is saying, no, no, I won't be burdened by Islam. I'll break out of Islam. So this is the view that informs their appreciation or rejection of our culture and our people. The more overtly Islamic one of us is, the less appreciable we are.
There's that, and I mean, I guess this brings me to my next question, and it's a double question in a sense, so you can address it in two parts. But tell us about what you think Persian literature has to offer to the world today, and also the Islamic tradition, because I think the premise of your response just now was that, in a way, Persian literature is very much linked to the Islamic tradition. And oftentimes you see that people in the West, they might be open to receiving knowledge and inspiration and emulation from the Persian literature, but when it comes to the Islamic tradition, they shy away from it unless they're eccentric or they're converts. But then tell us, do you think that the Persian literary tradition and also the Islamic tradition, do they have something to offer for meaning making and for inspiration and values to the modern world?
Absolutely. There's so many different views you could take for looking at any literature tradition, but specifically the medieval Persian canon. First of all, as a person studying history, as fascinated by the pre-modern medieval world, we as modern people have been so heavily propagandized about the Middle Ages and about why the past was terrible and why modernity was not just good but necessary, why the Middle East was, a place of barbarism when the colonists came. We were burning our women alive and we were selling slaves, so we deserved everything that came to us. So when you look at this poetry, it shows you, it humanizes, it explains the world then. What was the world like in Rumi's day? You know, what did they eat for dessert? What made them happy? What did they look forward to? What type of clothing did they wear? What was their food every night? What did they eat in the morning or late? You know, just very basic details like that can be fascinating, right? And then it also shows you a window into the pre-colonized, pre-modernized mind of our ancestors. How did Rumi understand place? How did he understand ethnicity and belonging? And how did he understand natural phenomena? How did he think about whether he was living in one place or another? Did he consider himself a refugee? Right? A very small anecdote. Many of us who've lived in the West, I mean, thankfully, and you know, may it remain this way, and we pray that Iran always be a safe and stable country. We're not forced to be out of Iran, right? Like me, you and I, we are always going back and forth. But many people who can't go back to their home countries, they feel like this is just some meaningless divine punishment or meaningless evil thing that's happened. Rumi, he had a section where he says, I have been sent away from my homeland to spread the elixir of Sufism and Islam to the Greek inhabitants of Anatolia. I have been brought here because these are good people who have been mahroom, who have been deprived of Sufism and our gnosis. So the goal of my life, the reason for my displacement, is to show these people the light of Sufism. Isn't that so beautiful, the pre-modern mind's way of making sense of tragedy? That it is tragic that I'm displaced from Balkh and that all of the people in Balkh were killed by the Mongols, by the way. None of Rumi's family survived. None of them joined him in Anatolia. No one left after the Mongols came. They all died. But what does Rumi think of this? He says, God has sent us here to spread Islam. Right? So to just these wisdoms. And then on top of that, there is also understanding different cultures. You know, if you're a Westerner to read pre-modern Middle Eastern poetry, you'll learn something about Islam. You'll learn something about Iranians in the region. And then also the most important thing is the spiritual element, the way it uplifts your spirit, the way that it can help you understand things, discover yourself, limit the worst tendencies. It really is a place to grow Persian poetry. It's not just fun, right?
That's right.
The people who read this poetry and take it to heart, they experience personal growth.
Then, I mean, also what you mentioned about Rumi making meaning of death. I mean, you also see it in Khayyam, and I mean, I think death and dying is one of the biggest philosophical questions that we face. And no matter, I mean, how scientifically advanced you get, you know, using modern science, you will still have a very hard time coming to terms with death and dying. And I think this is where the classical tradition is so important. And also Khayyam has it too. So Khayyam, I mean, for Khayyam, death is always lurking as just something that you have to prepare for. And yeah, so that's, I think for meaning making and for values is very important. And like you mentioned too, I mean, there is, I mean, it is true that the modern West might be more advanced technologically and politically, materially, it might be more powerful. But there's also this darker side to Western modernity. I mean, Walter Mignolo, the Duke University professor, he has two books. I think one is called The Darker Side of the Renaissance, and the other one is The Darker Side of Western Modernity. And so just as, you know, there is this enlightenment and liberty narrative to modernity, there's also the narrative of discipline and surveillance and control. So there is this darker side to Western modernity, and I think when there is a crisis of meaning, and I mean that's actually what a part of what postmodernism means. So postmodernism, in a way, is a consequence of modernity, and you have so much accumulation of information during the modern period that when you get to the 1970s and the 80s, a lot of the certainties that we had, and a lot of the meta-narratives that we had start being critiqued and questioned, so that generated a crisis of knowledge and what is knowable. And so in that sense, postmodernism led to a crisis of certainty and knowledge, and also a lack of meaning in a sense. And I think this is where the classical tradition, and not just the Persian or the Islamic tradition, I think the classical tradition from Europe itself or from many other traditions, from say India, China, even the Americas, can be very helpful in the making of meaning. Okay, so and let me ask you another question about your work. So you've done the translations of Rumi and many other Persian poets, including Persian poets that did not live in what is today's Iran, from Central Asia and South Asia. And I remember when I was first following you, you had a very small Twitter page. and then all of a sudden it blew up. So tell us about your work, your translations, a little bit more about that, and how you got to where you are.
Sure. I wanted to just add one detail regarding something you mentioned that I find so interesting. No matter how, like you said, technologically and materially, etc., advanced, modernity, scientism, seeing the world through strictly rational viewpoints, it can never conquer the questions of the soul and death. And one reason Rumi is so popular is so much of his poetry is about those two things: matters of the soul, the nafs, the ruh, as we break it down in Persian, and death. You know, that's one reason I think Westerners relate to Rumi, is because, you know, Hafiz talks about being in love. Well, that's not necessarily so interesting to someone who lives in the West, but Rumi really hits at those two questions. And all modern people deep down know that modernity has not adequately answered these questions, right? It has left you answerless, which leads to a really big crisis of meaning in the West. But in any case, you asked about what it's been like. So I started Persian Poetics as just a hobby, as an Instagram page. And you and I had been acquainted on social media, I think before then. So you've really seen the whole arc of it. I would just post poems that I was interested in. Perhaps you recall I was just always vaguely interested in Persian poetry. And I would make a point every week on the weekend to sit and translate some poems and post them. And then eventually I was convinced by friends to move to Twitter. And I couldn't have foreseen it. I thought Twitter was where rappers argue with each other and politicians make statements. This is Twitter from years ago, by the way, not current Twitter. And it happened that it would go viral there, but specifically the Rumi was Muslim campaign. And really since then, it's kind of been incredible that this demand has burgeoned for accurate translations. And as you mentioned, I don't limit the scope to one culture or time period. I try to look at all Persian poetry from all times and places. And I actually make a point to occasionally set aside what I would usually be interested in, such as Rumi, to look at Persian poets that would never get looked at. Like a woman Indian Mughal from the 18th century, you know, whose divan is hardly read or printed anywhere. Who
she was a
on
noble,
Ganjur.
correct?
Sometimes I have the Ganjur test. I say, let me find a poet not on Ganjur. Go ahead.
She was a noble. She was
a noble, yeah.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, and yeah,
so she was Mahfi. She was Aurangzeb's daughter.
Oh, right. So, Alamgir is his title. But
exactly,
then
exactly.
tell the viewers about Ganjur, because I think most of our viewers won't be familiar with Ganjur.
Excellent. Yeah, you're right. I mistakenly assume Ganjur is my life, so I think everyone knows it. Yeah. Ganjur, GANJOOR.net, is an excellent website run by an Iranian gentleman, I think in Isfahan. And he just, out of the love of, the goodness of his heart, created a website where all the Persian poets are hosted. And it's like Wikipedia in the sense that it's run by volunteers. So all the poems are edited and posted and corrected and commented on and voice overed. I mean, it's a great production by volunteers. And the website is fully donation oriented. There's no advertisements. I've tried my best to donate while I'm in Iran as I can. And it's just the best website for Persian poetry. In Persian, unfortunately, there's no English equivalent. And one way you can gauge for how well it is, or how well known a poet is whether they're on that website or not. Now it's very far reaching. And I like that the website actually has a map that shows you where all the poets lived or died. Mm-hmm. So you actually get a sense for the transnational nature of Persianate culture, that it's not relegated to just one contemporary nation state. Mm-hmm. It is a transnational culture.
And what I've been seeing on Ganjur lately is they actually give you the original text. So they have scans or copies of the original edition. That's a scholarly edition. So that's a really great edition.
Right. Yeah.
And now they're doing the AI. I mean, it would probably put you and I out of a job, but they're doing the AI meaning, like word by word meaning of the baits, or rather the verses. Yeah. So that's interesting addition. But yeah, I mean, I guess the fear is that some of the times the poems aren't. So the Persian poems they include on there are not consistent with the scholarly editions. But overall, I mean, I think it's a great tool to go to and learn, see the poems and things that you cannot just access
anywhere
else. Yeah, and so did you want to add anything about your work before I go to the next question?
Yeah, absolutely. So PersianPoetics.com, it's a course platform. I have classes on a variety of topics that you can see. We also meet every week on Saturday and Sunday mornings to read Rumi and Hafez. And we also have more of such classes in the works. Also in New York City, I have classes in person. So those of you listening who are in New York, you can find that on my social media. And as you mentioned, I do have the book, and there will be more books coming, inshallah, but those things take a lot of time, as you're well aware, Navid. So that would be the crux of my efforts, is posting, and I also have a lot of informational videos. So if you go on my social media, it's mostly just 1-minute videos of me explaining short topics about Persian poetry.
Yeah.
So really the goal of it is to just increase awareness about this heritage that we Iranians have that is sadly understudied, and when it is studied, not in the way I think that it's not with the rigor that it should be.
Yeah.
So I would say that
or the
really
broader
summarizes it.
Persian-speaking world has, including South Asia
Right,
and
agree.
Central Asia and all that. Great. Yes. So one last question that actually takes us to the next section, which is more about politics and the relationship between literature and politics. So there are many countries that are under U.S. sanctions right now. So Cuba is under an embargo. Venezuela, Syria was until recently, and it still is, I think, but there might be sanction relief soon. We have to wait and see. But Iran was also under U.S. sanctions, so any country that attempts to pursue a different political and economic model, the U.S. Treasury Department sanctions them, which means that they have limited or no ability to transact on the SWIFT system or on the international banking system, and also the sale of a lot of goods from international companies and brands is prohibited to their country. And so Iran, I think it's after Russia right now, it's the second most sanctioned country in the world, if the data I have looked at is correct. And so what ends up happening is that for me, I'm an academic and I have to use a lot of Zoom, but what's really crazy is that Zoom blocks access to Iranian IPs, which, I mean, it's an educational platform, but they use the excuse that, oh, I think they have a premium or a business section that's paid. So for other reasons, it's not clear. They're not always transparent about it, but they block access to Iranians, which means you have to use a VPN to slow down the connection. So I was wondering, you were doing work in Iran for a while. So how did you, how was the experience of the U.S. sanctions while you were doing your work in Iran?
Yeah, so I lived in Iran for 2 years recently, from I believe it was like 2022 to 2024. And I was there mostly to find these texts that I work on, to locate rare books, manuscripts, to just be immersed in Persian, because when you spend years abroad, you feel your not my reading capability, but your day-to-day fluency slipping. And I also had an aging grandfather, so I wanted to live with him in his final years. And I did face a lot of difficulties. So first of all, I had a payment platform, Patreon, where I didn't engage with it, right? It's not like I'm selling services through there. It was just a website where people can donate to me as a concept, right? That it exists in a US bank account. The account is in America. It's on a computer in America. And they closed access to me because they said I was living in a sanctioned country. And I had a long battle with them, and they finally ruled against me because it's their prerogative. And it's been covered on the Huffington Post. And what's funny is when I was outside of Iran, so not when I'm in Iran. If I'm in Iran accessing US banking, I get it. It's against the rules. But outside of Iran, I've had several accounts frozen. So in a period where I didn't go to Iran, I had a Chase account frozen and closed, and I had a PayPal account frozen and closed, and I believe one other as well, just because my platform has Persian in the name, because of Persian poetics. And Persian, although Iran hasn't been called Persia since I think 1935, is part of this broad-reaching sanctions regime. So if you go to a Syrian restaurant or Persian restaurant in America, in New York, and you Venmo your friends, oh, thanks for, here's half of my bill for Persian or Syrian or Cuban food, your Venmo account, will be frozen, or at least the payment will be blocked.
Yeah, they block a transaction at the very least.
I faced a lot of these difficulties. Yeah. And there's also chilling effect, right? So people know that now I'm in New York, but they might say, oh, he's Iranian, his accounts have been blocked. That means he's getting monitored. Let's not study with him and I've actually had this happen. So I was teaching someone in the UK, and some sanctions compliance department or something called them. and said, we think you're sending money to an Iranian national. And they got spooked and they stopped studying with me. This actually happened to two people in the UK, specifically in the UK. I don't know what's going on in the UK with that, but two students were called and contacted and they stopped studying with me from their payment provider based in the UK.
And what's really crazy is how over-inclusive the sanction compliance is, because the Treasury Department doesn't actually prohibit an American citizen, coming to, say, Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, whenever, and use, his Venmo. There's no like regulation against that. But these companies, just because they want to be extra careful or maybe extra aggressive or imperialistic, in terms of being aligned with the U.S. official policy, they just block everything, even for U.S. citizens.
Yeah. I actually, when my article went out, an Iranian-American lawyer who covers sanctions issues talked to me. She had helped people whose bank accounts had been frozen, and they had never even been to Iran. They were just like a person who was born in America, raised in America, and all of a sudden they just wake up, your bank account's been frozen, it's closed, right? And I've heard of several cases, even in my personal life. She said it's over compliance, right? They cast a broader net than the government itself requires of them. And what's weirder is because they're private companies, you have no recourse, right? Because they don't say, as we say in Persian, zerangan. They're very smart. They don't say, oh, because you're Persian or Iranian, because of your nationality or ethnicity, we've blocked you. Well, that's lawsuit material, right? They say, oh, because your IP is associated with Iran, or, Patreon actually did research into me. They went on my social media and decided that I was living in Iran. And I fought with them. I said, well, what does it mean to live in Iran? So if I go back and forth, does that mean I live in Iran or America? How long do I have to spend every year? And how do you know how long I am? And it's so ridiculous that these punitive measures and punishments that are designed to limit our cultural impact as well, right? Because that's part of the fight. Is they view me as a conduit for Iranian culture, so I should also be punished and limited, because God forbid something good about Iran is conveyed to the world. Or God forbid an Iranian-American, who is, by the way, I am critical of Iran, maybe even too critical, like all Iranians are. We're always complaining and criticizing because we want Iran to be better. But God forbid an Iranian-American who doesn't push our narratives. Because if you're an Iranian-American and you chant for regime change, and you say, the mullahs are foaming at the mouths and these Muslims, and oh my God, Iran, we should just be friends with Israel again. Oh my God. If you do all that, then you're best friends, right? Then you get speeches and you get invited for talks and interviews, and I would have a book about Iran, and I would be giving a talk at the National Foreign Policy Institute thing, and like Eli Kalabon and all these characters, Chelsea Hard, they pop up every 6 months, right? But if you have a tempered view on Iran, if you say, no, actually, I love my country and I want the best for it, but I also don't want it to be destroyed in this geopolitical game you've set up, then you're persona non grata, then you get attacked by online armies, then you get doxxed. Like, I have experienced all these things. Then you get a phone call from someone who reads your address and reads your mother's name, X, Y, and Z, right? Then you get photographs sent of you. This happened to me, by the way. Someone sent me a photograph that was sent to them of me in public in Istanbul without me knowing.
Oh my God.
These are all designed to scare you, right? So, and by the way, I'm not necessarily even a political person. I just occasionally say, hey, I don't want Iran to be destroyed.
No,
hey, I don't think it's fair that Iran is sanctioned.
And I mean, and that's what's very, very strange here, because you actually have a pretty nuanced view. I mean, if people follow you on Twitter, you see that you criticize everyone. And it's not that, you don't have a certain talking point that you want to repeat. I've seen that you reflect on issues, and sometimes I disagree with you, especially in politics. But at the same time, you have nuanced views, but at the same time, they even come after you. And I think you're very much right that there's this whole industry in the West that, if you have a native face that aligns with the imperialist discourse and with the imperialist policies, they really lap that up. And they really use you for their purposes. But then if you have an anti-imperialist agenda or anti-imperialist positions, then getting a platform is much more difficult, and also there's a lot more pressure and censorship on you. And you're talking about just promoting Persian culture that's not even necessarily tied to Iran. It could be tied to, say, India or Tajikistan that have better relations with the U.S. and the West. But even on that, there are these problems. And I think it also shows how coordinated and united capital and political power in America are. Because if the state or the Treasury Department takes a position, all these companies follow to the teeth, or even more so, because they even go beyond the Treasury Department regulations and mandates, and they just close everything and block everything, all the transactions, and make life difficult for Iranian-Americans. Or even, I think, Afghan Americans, because I think Afghanistan is also under some sanctions, even though they're not anywhere as comprehensive as the ones that target Iran.
Right, yeah. And I think certain countries have certain windows. So in Afghanistan, you can send money to your relatives without any issue. Right. And see, nominally, this exists in Iran. I was contacted by a charity once that said, can you help us raise money for Iran? And I said, well, how are you going to do that? Do you realize this is illegal? And they said, no, we actually got the exemption from the State Department or the Treasury or something. So there are nominally, like they say, medicine isn't sanctioned. Okay, that's true. That's actually true. If I want to send medicine from America to Iran, that's fine.
But a transaction is difficult.
Right, but if you create an environment where Iran is difficult to do business with, then in effect, medicine is less available, right? So I posted one time, I said, being an Iranian means going from pharmacy to pharmacy, trying to find medicine for your dying grandfather to make his life a little bit more comfortable and not finding it, right? So I'm not a representative of any government. I am not ideologically aligned or disaligned from any group or movement. I consider myself very independent-minded, and it annoys many. But if you don't fully support the destruction of our country and its full isolation and the immiseration of the average people to that end, then you're odious. You're an enemy. You're one of them, right? This is why I get a million messages. Oh, you're a mullah-zadeh. You're the son of some mullah. You're agha-zadeh. You're the son of some agent.
You're not
No, actually, my family. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say you're not Shahzadeh, but you're Shahzadeh. So
yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. It's
well,
actually, no, my family is lower middle class in Iran. So I don't have any financial interest in what I say. It's just I'm an Iranian. I can't support the destruction of my country and my people. As much as I may disagree with one policy or another in the country, that internal disagreement doesn't amount to wanting to see bread shortages and medicine shortages and people's lives upended.
Yeah, and you know, and
right?
Yeah, and you know what's really crazy is I've heard this from people here. I don't know how true it is, but I think it is true that actually Coca-Cola, the company Coca-Cola, got an, because you talked about exemptions. So Coca-Cola got an exemption to actually sell the syrup to an Iranian company, so they make Coca-Cola. And if you come to Iran, Coca-Cola actually, you know, for the longest time I thought it was fake or a bootleg. But I've been told here that they use the actual Coca-Cola syrup because Coca-Cola.
No, it's real. It's
real.
Yeah,
so they got an exemption. But what's crazy about this is that they give an exemption to this company that will generate a lot of unhealthiness among Iranians, but they're not giving exemptions for the. I mean, for the medicine, you said there are exemptions, but I think the fear of transactions makes it difficult. But I mean, I think more important are the planes. I mean, if they give an exemption to Boeing, you know, then we could have, you know, modern planes that don't crash. And it's a safety issue. But when it comes to the more important issue, they don't give the exemptions. But for something like Coca-Cola that's unhealthy and useless,
it's a poison,
they give the exemption. It's a poison.
Exactly.
Ronaldo also didn't
absolutely.
drink it. You know, if you remember that he put so when he was doing the press interview, he put the Coca-Cola aside and he said aqua, and he put the water in the middle. And I think that actually...
That's great. I love that. Yeah. Well, you know, they say Coca-Cola controls the U.S. government when it comes because of how rich and powerful they are. And I mean, a lot of these companies... on their own accord, essentially, these banana companies and sugarcane companies that work with sugarcane, would just do coup d'etats in South America and Central America and the Caribbean, right? So who's to say they can't twist an arm in Washington and get an exemption to sell their poisonous drink? Among our bad habits, see, I said earlier, I criticize everything. Among our worst habits as an Iranian and all global South people, I've seen it everywhere. It's in South America, it's in Mexico, it's in Iran, it's in the Arab world. Overconsumption of these sugary poisons is a really big problem we have. So but anyway, look, I criticize fairly, but because I don't want Iran destroyed and because I don't want my people to live through a war like we have before. I don't want a repeat of that for some political adventure. I am an evil person. I should have my bank accounts closed. I should be shunned from this or that thing. I shouldn't be afforded any official opportunities. So it's a price you pay for not selling yourself,
That's
unfortunately.
right.